Some stories do not die quietly. They linger, they resurface, sometimes they return with teeth. In the early 18th century, in the Serbian village of Medvedja, the dead were not being left alone. The ground was opened, graves were disturbed, bodies were inspected by frightened villagers, and, eventually, by officials, who had been sent to make sense of what was happening. One name came to the centre of the fear: Arnold Paole. He was said to have been a former soldier, a man who returned from military service carrying a story darker than memory. Before his death, Paole told neighbours he had encountered a vampire while stationed in lands under Ottoman control. He believed he had been attacked. To protect himself, he said he had eaten earth from the creature's grave and used its blood against it. A rough folk remedy for something he feared was already inside him. But death is not always so easily tricked. According to the later reports, Paole died after an accident. Soon after, people began to say he was troubling the living. Some fell ill. Some claimed he had visited them in the night. The fear was not only that Paole had died, the fear was that he had returned, hungry. So the villagers dug. What they believed they found was not a body at peace. The corpse was said to be whole, ruddy, and marked with blood, as if it had recently fed. A stake was driven through the chest. The body bled and groaned, they said. Then it was burned. This was not merely a rumour told beside a winter fire. The case was recorded with official concern by Austrian military surgeons and administrators, part of a wider Habsburg attempt to investigate, document and contain reports of vampirism in Serbian borderlands. At the same time, Europe was praising reason, measurement and Enlightenment science. Officials were still writing reports about the dead who would not stay dead. Why? Because belief can move a village, and a frightened village can become a problem for the state. The story of Arnold Paole became one of the most famous vampire cases in Europe. It travelled through reports, letters, newspapers, and learned debate. It helped push the word vampire into wider European imagination. But Paole was not the first, and he was not the last. Across cultures and centuries, people have feared that the dead can hunger. Not metaphorically, for blood, for warmth, for breath, for the life that remains in others. You are listening to Noir Frequency. Tonight we examine the folklore of the vampire. Today the vampire is almost too familiar. A figure of books, films, games, gothic romance, high collars, pale skin, elegant rooms and moonlit windows. But the older vampire is not elegant. It is local, intimate and often ugly. It comes from sickness, grief, bad burial, bad luck, and the suspicion that death has not finished its work. The vampire is not one creature, it is a pattern of fear. A dead neighbour who returns, a mother who loses a child, a demon who steals breath, a witch who slips through a crack in the wall, a corpse that does not decay in the expected way, a disease no one can explain, a family that keeps dying, one by one. The vampire is a creature of hunger, but not only for blood. It hungers for explanation. It appears when something precious is being taken, and no one can say why. Children die, families waste away, livestock fail. Sleep becomes dangerous. The grave begins to feel less like an ending than a door. This episode follows that question. From the vampire panics of 18th century Serbia to night demons of the ancient world, to corpse hoppers, skin shedders, fireballs, graveyard spirits, and the rules used to hold them back. This story is not only about monsters, it is about what people do when grief needs a body. Let us stay for a moment in the Balkans. The panic around Arnold Paole belongs to a wider pattern of fear, investigation, exhumation, and official record. One of the most important cases came just before it. The year was 1725. The place was Kisilovo, a village in Hapsburg-controlled Serbia. The name was Peter Plogojowitz, also recorded as Peter Blagojevich. Plogojowitz died after a brief illness. Within days, more villagers followed him. The number is usually given as 9 deaths within 8 days. The community was not only frightened by the speed of the deaths, they were frightened by what the dying reportedly said. Several claimed that Peter had visited them in the night, pressing upon them, stealing their breath. His wife, according to the account, fled the village in terror. Officials were called. An imperial provisor became involved. The body was exhumed. The report describes a corpse that appeared disturbingly fresh, with signs that the villagers read as proof of vampirism. To the people of Kisilovo, these were not natural deaths, they were signs. A stake was driven through the corpse, the body was burned, the report travelled onward. Local terror became an official document. Village fear entered European print culture. Then came Paole in Medvedja. His death is placed earlier in the accounts, but the major investigation took place in the winter of 1731 into 1732. Again, death clustered. Again, graves were opened, and again, officials recorded bodies that villagers believed had not behaved like ordinary dead. Again, the answer was stake, fire, and ritual control. This is where the vampire becomes especially strange. Not because a corpse was feared, many cultures fear the corpse, but because these fears moved through bureaucracy, surgeons, officers, imperial authorities, newspapers, scholars, villagers and priests all found themselves circling the same question. What do we do when the dead are accused? Vampire panics often begin with illness. Not always, but often. A village experiences too many deaths too quickly. A family wastes away. People grow pale. They cough blood. They weaken slowly as if something unseen is feeding from them. Before modern germ theory, before antibiotics, before the language of infection became ordinary, sickness could look like predation. This is one reason that the vampire makes sense. It gives disease a face. Not fate, not bad air, not invisible contagion. A body, a neighbour, a dead person who can be found, opened, accused, pierced, burned and stopped. In 1892, far from Serbia, the pattern appeared again in Exeter, Rhode Island. The disease was tuberculosis, then called consumption. Its symptoms were cruelly vampire-like. The living grew pale and thin, coughed blood, and seemed drained from within. Mercy Brown died after tuberculosis had already struck her family. When fear and desperation gathered, her body was exhumed. To the people involved, her condition seemed suspicious enough to require action. Her heart was removed and burned. The ashes were mixed into a liquid and given to her brother Edwin, in the hope that it would break the wasting sickness. He died anyway. This was not medieval Europe. This was late 19th century America. The tools had changed, the setting had changed, but the structure remained. A family was dying, medicine could not save them. Fear required an offering. The dead were made to answer for the unbearable. The vampire in these cases is not only a monster, it's an explanation under pressure. When life is being taken, the mind asks, who is taking it? Before the word vampire was spoken in Europe, there were older hungers. They did not always drink blood. Sometimes they stole breath. Sometimes they took infants. Sometimes they fed on life at the moment it was most fragile. In Mesopotamian traditions, spirits such as Lilitu moved through the night. Later imagination would connect such figures to Lilith, a more famous and shifting name in Jewish folklore and later esoteric writing. The details change across time and tradition, but the fear remains recognizable. A night figure associated with danger to infants, pregnancy, sexuality, sleep, and the threshold between safety and loss. Then there is Lamashtu, one of the most feared demonesses of ancient Mesopotamia. She threatens mothers and infants. She brings disease, miscarriage, and deaths. Amulets were made not to honor her but to keep her away. These figures are not vampires in the modern sense. They do not wear capes, they don't rise from coffins, but they belong to the same family of fear. The fear that life can be stolen in the night, that the body is porous, and that the vulnerable must be guarded from invisible hunger. In Greece, the fear took other forms. Lamia was imagined as a woman or queen whose grief became monstrous. She devours children, a figure of loss turned outward into hunger. Empusa, associated with Hecate, appears as a shape-shifting night figure, seductive and dangerous. The Striges, Roman screeching night creatures, blur the line between witch, bird, demon, and blood drinker. What unites these older figures is proximity. They are close, too close, in the bed, in the womb, in the nursery, in the blood. They are not wilderness monsters, they are domestic terrors. This is one of the oldest roots of the vampire. Not a nobleman in a castle, not a stranger at the gate. Something that enters the space where life should be protected. Something that feeds where love is most exposed. The hunger that walks by night does not wear the same face in every land. In China, the Zhongshu is not a suave count or a seductive wraith. It is rigid with death, a corpse in formal robes, often imagined hopping rather than walking. It drains not blood but qi, life force itself. The Zhongshu is not always evil in the simple sense. It is unmoored, improperly returned, a dead body out of place. If the charm fails, if control is lost, the corpse no longer obeys, it feeds. In the Philippines, the manananggal is a woman by day and a predator by night. Her upper body separates from her lower half. Wings emerge. She flies through the darkness, hunting, especially for the vulnerable, the sleeping, and the unborn. This is a vampire of pregnancy fear, body fear, and threshold fear. A story about the terror of the womb being reached from outside. A story about a body divided against itself. Across the Caribbean, the sucuyant, or lugaru, slips out of her skin and moves as fire. She enters through cracks, keyholes, and openings in the house. She feeds from soft places on the body, leaving bruises or marks behind. Her story carries many histories at once. African belief, European demonology, colonial language, plantation memory, local fear, and the suspicion that the dangerous figure may be someone known to the community. Not a stranger, a neighbour. In India, beings such as the Vaitala haunt corpses and cremation grounds. They are corpse spirits, graveyard intelligences, not elegant blood drinkers, but they belong to the same borderland between life, death, possession and hunger. The Brahma Perush is more grotesque still in some tellings, associated with blood, entrails, skulls, and the violent appetite of the cremation ground. In West African tradition, the Adze can appear as a firefly and pass through the night unseen. When caught, it may take human form. Its bite is connected with sickness, wasting, and misfortune. In Malaysia, the Penanggalan appears as a woman's head with organs trailing beneath, flying through the night in search of blood, especially around childbirth and vulnerability. In Romania, the Strigoi haunts its own bloodline. In Albania, the Lugat lingers as a troubling revenant. In Greek islands, the Vrikolakas walks among the dead who are not properly at rest. These creatures differ wildly. Some are corpses, some are witches, some are demons, some are fire, some drink blood, some drain breath, life force, milk, fertility or luck. But the pattern remains. Something crosses a threshold at night and takes what should not be taken. The vampire is not a single myth. It is a mirror, and every culture that looks into it sees a different wound. The vampire is not only identifiable by what it does, it is also identified by what the living do to stop it. Across Europe, suspected vampires were handled through ritual containment. Bodies were staked, heads were removed. Mouths were filled with stones, bricks, coins, or earth. Sickles were laid across throats. Iron was used. Graves were salted, bodies were burned. These were not random acts of violence. These were procedures, a grim technology of fear, a way of making sure the dead could not walk, bite, speak, chew, or return. In some Polish burials, archaeologists have found sickles placed across the necks of the dead. If the corpse rose, the blade would meet it. Elsewhere, stones or bricks were placed in the mouth, stopping the dead from feeding, speaking, or chewing their way back into the world. In 2006, on the island of Lazzaretto Nuovo, in the Venetian lagoon, archaeologists uncovered a 16th century female skeleton with a brick placed in her mouth. The site had been used during the plague quarantine. The burial became known in popular media as the Vampire of Venice. Whether or not the person was thought of exactly as a vampire in the later folkloric sense, the gesture belongs to the same world of fear. The mouth is dangerous, the corpse is not trusted. The dead might still be able to take from the living. This is what makes vampire belief so physical. It is not only story, it leaves marks in graves. It changes burial practice. It directs violence towards the corpse. It turns fear into procedure. Vampires are powerful, but they are rarely free. That is one of the strangest things about them. Again and again, vampire-like beings are bound by rules. They must be invited, they must return to the grave, they must avoid certain objects, they can be delayed by seeds, grains, knots, or numbers. The counting compulsion is especially strange. In some traditions, rice, seeds, or grains can be scattered to delay the undead. The creature must stop and count them, giving the living time until dawn. This appears in different forms from Europe to China and beyond. Why counting? Perhaps because counting is order, a number placed against chaos, a way of forcing the supernatural into a task, a way of saying, if the rules are followed, the darkness can be delayed. Other protections are more familiar. Garlic, iron, holy water, crucifixes, salt, thorns, fire, mirrors, and thresholds. Each belongs to a different religious, magical, or local logic, but the function is similar. The object draws a line. The invitation rule is one of the most psychologically powerful. A vampire cannot enter unless invited. Not in every tradition, but in enough of the modern imagination that the idea has become central. As folklore, it spreads to thresholds. As metaphor, it speaks to violation. The fear that harm does not always break the door down. Sometimes it asks politely. Sometimes it waits until we open. That is the paradox. The vampire is a creature of chaos, but also compulsion. It threatens the natural order, yet can be bound by tiny rules. It may be strong enough to drain the living, but weak enough to be delayed by scattered rice. This is not a flaw in the myth. It is the point. Rules make fear bearable. They tell us that if the monster comes, there is still something to do. Let us return to the central question. Why the vampire? Why this explanation? And why the dead who feed? Because the vampire makes sense of the senseless. Where medicine failed, folklore gave structure. Where grief had nowhere to go, the myth gave it a body. Where death came too quickly, the community found someone to blame. Not the gods, not fate, not themselves. A thing, a corpse, a monster, something that could be found and acted upon. But the vampire is not only a scapegoat, it is more intimate than that. It often comes from within the family, the village, the bed, the bloodline. The strigoi returns to its kin. The lugaru is a neighbour. The dead daughter becomes a threat to the brother. The loved face becomes the feared face. That is the terror of these accounts. The vampire is not always a stranger, it is us, turned wrong. Many vampire traditions also cluster around sleep. Victims wake breathless, pinned, pressed upon, drained. Modern medicine might call some of these experiences sleep paralysis, but the experience is older than the diagnosis, and the feeling remains powerful. Something is here, something has come back. Blood, too, is more than biology. It means vitality, lineage, covenant, family and life. To drink blood is to cross a boundary between bodies. To steal it is to turn intimacy into predation. That is why the vampire lives in the blur. Life and death, love and hunger, grief and accusation, care and consumption. The human and the thing that used to be human. The vampire is the shape our fear takes when someone is gone, but not gone enough. Let us look again, not to decide whether the grave is always silent, but to see what the story carries. A Serbian village opening the grave of Arnold Paole. A Habsburg report containing Peter Plogojowitz. A family in Rhode Island burning Mercy Brown's heart against consumption. Ancient night spirits threatening cradles and mothers. Greek and Roman monsters feeding at the edges of grief, desire and sleep. A Chinese corpse that hops and drains life force. A Philippine body divided against itself. A Caribbean fire that slips through keyholes. A West African firefly that becomes sickness, a graveyard spirit in India, a head trailing through the night in Malaysia, sickles at the throat, bricks in the mouth, rice at the threshold, fire in the grave. None of these pieces are identical. They do not need to be. The vampire is not one creature. It's a question that cultures answer in different bodies. What is taking life from us? Why do the dead still feel close? What do we do when love becomes fear? How do we make illness visible? How do we stop grief from entering the house? The answer again and again is ritual. Dig, stake, burn, salt, count, bind, bury again. Tell the story. Because in the face of death, explanation is not enough. People need action. A line drawn at the door, or a charm above the cradle, a brick in the mouth, a heart reduced to ash. A way to say, this far and no further. The vampire endures because the questions it raises never leave us. What do we do with grief? What do we do with disease? What do we do with the dead when they remain inside us? We dress the vampire differently now. Velvet, leather, gothic romance, cinema, streaming screens. But beneath the costume the older hunger remains. The fear that something we loved might return changed. The fear that illness has a will. The fear that the boundary between the living and the dead is thinner than we need it to be. By night they feed. By day we draw the line again. At the grave, at the door, at the body, and we hope it holds. You have been listening to Noir Frequency. If this story found you, there are a few small ways that you can help the signal travel further. Like the episode, share it with someone who knows that some stories do not die quietly. Subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. If you want to go deeper, you can join the Patreon at patreon.com/noirfrequency for early access, bonus material, and an ad-free feed. And if you want to carry the signal out into the world, you can visit noirfrequency.com for the merch store. Thank you for being here, and until next time, keep listening.